Lyndon B. Johnson's relationship with the family of John F. Kennedy is very well known. However, he also had a relationship with another prominent political family of recent decades, the Bush family. While both Bush presidents, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, only took office many years after Johnson's death, the Bush family was active on the political scene during the majority of Johnson's time in national politics, and Johnson crossed paths with them on multiple occasions. Despite party differences, the relationship was surprisingly friendly at times and created a long-term connection that still exists to this day. There are differences and similarities between Johnson and the Bushes that are immediately evident. Johnson was a lifelong Democrat and an extremely devoted one. He once outright stated, quote, "The Democratic Party at its worst is still better than the Republican Party at its best." All of the most prominent members of the Bush family for multiple generations have been Republicans, from the beginning of the 20th century to the present day. This includes, of course, the two Bush presidents. Johnson and the Bush family are commonly associated with the state of Texas. Johnson not only established his political career in Texas, but was born and raised in the state, as was his father. His family had moved there during the 1800s. Neither of the Bush presidents were actually born in Texas. H.W. Bush moved there when he was 24, with his family having a long history in the North. Johnson had his first interactions with the Bush family when they were still Northerners. He served in the United States Senate alongside H.W.'s father, Prescott Bush, a Republican senator from Connecticut. Johnson's and Prescott's tenures overlapped from 1952 to 1961, meaning they served alongside each other for nearly a decade. They even served together on the Senate Armed Services Committee. In 1964, the 40-year-old H.W. Bush ran for one of Texas's seats in the United States Senate. This was during Johnson's presidency. In a phone call with a fellow Democrat, Johnson discussed the election in his home state. He described Bush as an attractive young candidate who had a good chance of winning if Democrats didn't stop infighting. Johnson campaigned for the Democratic candidate, focusing not on attacking Bush, but on promoting his party's platform. Bush lost the race, but 2 years later, he successfully ran for a seat in the House of Representatives. There, he'd have a mixed record with the Johnson administration. He vocally opposed many of Johnson's economic policies. However, he supported his handling of the Vietnam War and some of his Great Society programs. Notably, he voted to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1968. The act's most well-known titles outlawed discrimination in housing and were very unpopular in the South. While many Northern and Western Republicans supported the act, it was almost universally opposed by Southern Republicans and by most Southern Democrats. Bush's support of the act was considered a bold move for a freshman representative. As Bush's career was on the ascent, Johnson's was on a rapid and dramatic decline. Over the course of his presidency, he'd become so unpopular that he didn't even run for another term. He left office on January 20th, 1969, with the fear that he'd only be remembered for his failures. A crowd of well-wishers gathered to see him off before he boarded his plane for Texas. In the crowd of Democratic supporters was a lone face from the Republican Party, sophomore Representative Bush. In a 1987 autobiographical account, Bush described himself as the only Republican there. He recounted how, as a Republican, he'd been set aside a special seat to watch the inaugural parade of the incoming Republican president, Richard Nixon, who Bush and his family had past political ties to from many years prior. However, Bush recalled being urged by one of his aides, quote, "What you ought to do is go to Andrews Air Force Base to say goodbye to President Johnson, to wish him well. He's a Democrat, but he's a fellow Texan, and he's been our president." Bush's son, George W. Bush, recounted how Johnson made a friendly invitation to his father. Quote, "George, anytime you need to, come over to the ranch." He recalled his father took up the invitation, where he rode around in the back of a Cadillac as Johnson showed off the many acres of his property, as he customarily did with guests. By H.W. Bush's account, On one visit to the ranch, he mentioned to Johnson that he was contemplating another run for the Senate, but was unsure about risking his seat in the House, especially as he had a place on the House Ways and Means Committee, a very significant appointment for a representative of his tenure. He claimed that Johnson made it clear that he would never support a Republican over a Democrat. However, having served in both the House and the Senate, Johnson shared a piece of advice with him on whether it was worth making the run. Quote, "Being a member of the Senate and a member of the House is the difference between chicken salad and chicken shit. Do I make my point?" Bush ultimately made another unsuccessful run at the Senate. As expected, Johnson had supported the Democratic candidate, though not as enthusiastically as he'd done in the past. Whether this lack of enthusiasm was in some way support for Bush isn't clear. It was possibly due to unrelated factors, such as his declining health. The Democratic candidate, Lloyd Bentsen, was viewed by some liberals as being far too conservative, and some liberals had considered supporting Bush as the lesser of two evils, or at very least to send a message to their party. During the race, Bush had run firmly as a Republican, vocally supporting President Nixon, who Johnson despised. However, Bush had at least once quoted Johnson during the campaign in a positive way, which was notable considering Johnson's reputation among Republicans. Though he lost the Senate race, H.W. Bush would receive a position within the Nixon administration, which eventually led to a successful political career, peaking with his election to the presidency in 1988. Johnson died in early 1973, so he never had the chance to see any of Bush's most impactful years in politics. George W. Bush didn't know Johnson as well, but in his personal biography, he recalled meeting him. He was 10 years old and in Washington, D.C. visiting his grandfather, Prescott. Prescott introduced him to Johnson, telling Johnson, quote, "I've got one of your constituents here." He then had his grandson shake Johnson's hand. W. Bush mainly remembered Johnson for his infamous stature. At 6 feet 4 inches, he towered over the rest of the senators except for Prescott, who also stood at the same exceptional height. In 2014, W. Bush spoke at the LBJ Presidential Library for the Civil Rights Summit and reflected positively on Johnson. Quote, "The real influence of a president is not found in the headlines. It can only be judged with time. And at the distance of half a century, we know, with complete certainty, that America is a more just and generous country because LBJ set his mind and will to the cause of civil rights." He praised Johnson for having the, quote, "uncommon determination to pass civil rights legislation," for encouraging the Republican Party to think back to Abraham Lincoln and to embrace its, quote, "best traditions," and for calling on, quote, "his fellow Southerners to lay down the heavy burdens of their past." On other occasions, he did criticize Johnson. One of these would be his criticism of when Johnson would, quote, "listen illegally to the conversations of innocent people." He also criticized what he called Johnson's micromanagement of the Vietnam War. Ironically, many would draw unfavorable comparisons between Johnson's handling of the Vietnam War and Bush's handling of conflicts in the Middle East. There are also points for comparison between Johnson and H.W. Bush. Both served as vice presidents to handsome, charismatic, and telegenic presidents. And, despite their own experience in politics, they felt as though they were overlooked as they didn't have the same public appeal. They eventually won their own presidential terms with landslide victories, but neither could maintain that support. Even the successes of their administrations were ultimately overshadowed by their failures. And to many Americans, they'd simply be remembered as the tall, awkward, and dull successors to better presidents. The connection between Johnson and the Bushes might not be one of the most significant in presidential history, but it has been long-lasting. Before George W. Bush's 2014 speech at the LBJ Library, he notably invited the Johnson family to the White House twice during his presidency, once in 2005 and then again in 2007, when he signed a House resolution dedicating the Department of Education as the Lyndon B. Johnson Federal Building. In 2013, The LBJ Foundation awarded George H.W. Bush with the Liberty and Justice for All Award, presented by Johnson's 2 daughters. About a dozen individuals have received the award, and Bush remains one of only 2 Republicans to receive it. Upon his death in 2018, the LBJ Foundation gave tribute. Johnson's younger daughter, Lucy, said, quote, "One might disagree with a policy or a decision of George Herbert Walker Bush, but no one ever questioned his patriotism, his human decency, his selfless service to his God, country, family, and friends. He represented the best within us. Our family and our nation loved him." Johnson's eldest daughter, Linda, said, quote, "I have not known a person who was more gracious and thoughtful. He always extended every kindness to me and my family. For President Bush, friendship was first, politics was second." Perhaps it was this characteristic that contributed to the long-lasting relationship, a relationship between the family of Johnson, a devoted Democrat, and a family of the rival party. Author Robert Dallek, in his biography of Johnson, described the scene in which Bush arrived at Andrews Air Force Base to say farewell to Johnson. Dallek's description of the scene illustrates the connection between the two. Quote, "To Johnson's surprise, the Texas Republican Congressman George Bush and his wife Barbara were in the crowd. Asked why he was there to see the president off, Bush replied, quote, 'He has been a fine president and invariably courteous and fair to me and my people, and I thought that I belonged here to show in a small way how much I have appreciated him.' The Bush's presence touched Johnson. It gave him solace to believe that as he ended his 32-year career, he was being honored not as a partisan, but a statesman who had struggled to do his best for all Americans in tumultuous times. To support this channel, consider subscribing or donating on Patreon via the link in the description below. You can also browse the channel for more videos like this on United States presidents, from George Washington to Donald Trump, discussing their careers, personal lives, and places in history.